I'm humbled to be here because I'm flattered that I've been asked for my advice. I probably should have said, I don't know. But there's something about being a professor that when you're asked a question, you feel compelled to answer it. So since you asked, I will make some comments. The United States passed its first antitrust law in 1890. It was the Sherman Antitrust Act. And then about 20 years later, there was tremendous frustration that the act had not done what it was intended to do, that there remained powerful business forces that the government and the competition law was unsuccessful in curbing, and that there was a need to impose tougher antitrust regulation. And that's why in 1914 we got the Federal Trade Commission Act and the Clayton Antitrust Act. And it seems to me that what I understand is going on in Mexico now is a similar sense of frustration, almost with the same amount of time lapsing after the passage of your first antitrust law. And these are very hard issues, but there's a temptation when you're feeling this pressure that the current law isn't doing enough to perhaps overreact. And I think that's the question that you really need to ask about the individual provisions, or some of the individual provisions of this law, as to whether you're going too far. I would echo what John Fingleton said, that there's a lot about this law that's very good and that I would applaud. And I particularly applaud the provisions that give the Competition Commission the ability to go advocate with respect to other regulators, because there is a real risk of regulation becoming becoming captured by political interests and acting against consumers, and it's important that there be an advocate for consumers. I'd like to tell you that we know the answer to these questions in the United States and that we've solved them, but we're still wrestling with the same issues. The first principle is that the problem that the antitrust laws are dealing with is quite real. And a number of the speakers have already said this, that the incentive to avoid competition is very, very strong. And when companies succeed in doing that, it is harmful to consumers, and it's particularly harmful to poor consumers. And it's vitally important that there be vigorous antitrust enforcement to try to correct that. Second, I'm not sure I'm going to get as much agreement on this principle on the panel, but I think of regulation and antitrust as being largely competitive approaches to solving that problem. And that the benefit of antitrust is that it is light-handed regulation, and it avoids the inefficiency that we've learned over the years crops up if you try to regulate a sector too heavily. The third principle, and I don't think John will disagree with this, or Elisa, or anyone else who's been at one of the regulatory commissions, antitrust authorities have their own perverse incentives. And it's important to recognize that when you're designing the law. And these perverse incentives arise for a couple of reasons. So one is everyone wants to feel useful, and doing something feels more useful than doing nothing. So there's this, once you're in one of these positions, there's this urge to intervene. And I was interested in John's comment about the studies the FTC has done at times about sectors where it has had to, where it's concluded that there really weren't problems and that there wasn't good reason for intervention. And those, having participated in those studies, those were politically the most charged things that we had to deal with, and there was overwhelming pressure to arrive at conclusions other than that. And that's another reason why there are perverse incentives for antitrust authorities, because there are very strong political pressures. And really, antitrust policy at its worst is when it becomes politicized. Regrettably, there's experience with this, where antitrust enforcement gets used as a tool to punish political enemies or to reward political friends. There was a terrible scandal in the 70s with the Nixon administration in the United States, and so my own perception in the United States is that because of those scandals, we've had less of a problem with it. But it's but you can't ignore that reality. The temptation to go after highly successful companies is overwhelming. And everyone talks about the importance of protecting competition and not protecting competitors. But no matter how many times they say it, it's hard to look at a highly successful company and as an antitrust regulator and not suspect that they somehow achieved their success through something other than honest competition. And whatever temptation the regulator has to go after successful companies, you can rest assured that competitors are in there complaining to the Competition Commission, urging them to take action. And it is a reality of antitrust enforcement throughout the world that antitrust is viewed as a competitive weapon, and so when that happens, when you design the law, you have to think about whether or not you've designed it in a way that you can resist those pressures. Okay, a fourth principle is, over the last, I don't know whether you want to call it 10 years or 20 years, we've seen a proliferation of products that none of us had ever imagined, that consumers very much want, and that the people who did have the foresight to imagine them have been highly successful with. And I would like to get this sentence out without using the word dominant, but there's at least the appearance of dominance. And so, but you have to remember that consumers very much want these products and been made better off by these products. Okay, so based on these four principles, I believe that there is a conventional wisdom internationally in antitrust about what the priorities of an antitrust commission or an antitrust authority should be. So there's widespread agreement that the price fixing and the equivalents of price fixing, like market division and so on, price fixing and undue market power is to nip it in the bud by preventing competitors from merging. A third point of consensus, I believe, is that the vertical mergers and vertical restraints are much different from horizontal mergers and horizontal restraints, and that you have to be very careful about condemning them. That certainly they shouldn't be per se illegal, to the extent that they should be per se anything, they should be per se legal, but that in any event, if you're going to view them from the perspective of a rule of reason, you need to recognize that there are often good reasons for these to exist, and that vertically related parties generally have an interest in keeping prices down, not keeping prices up. And then a fourth point of consensus is that you have to be very careful about going after unilateral conduct. In my mind, the greatest sentence that I've read in antitrust jurisprudence is from the Alcoa decision in the US when Learned Hand said, the successful competitor having been urged to compete must not be turned upon when he wins. And you've got to be, you have to build protections in to make sure that that doesn't happen. So based on what I think is this conventional wisdom, there are aspects of the law, and they've been talked about already today, that jump out as flying in the face of what I think is the conventional wisdom. So one aspect of the law is that goes against the conventional wisdom is this proposal to allow market studies and allow actions to be taken in response to those market studies, even if no violation of the law has been found. I was very interested in John's discussion of the experience in Britain, because that's the one of the very few exceptions internationally where they have this power. And we obviously don't have the time to do this, but of the cases that he mentioned, the only one that I would applaud would be the airport case, and which of course is an example that had as its root a state-sanctioned monopoly. Everyone, all of the others, really have these features that there's a risk of having punished companies simply for having competed successfully, and your point that once the sector comes under investigation, you're not going to, no one's going to want to invest in that sector because they're afraid that the assets they're going to have to be forced to divest the assets at a price that might not remunerate them, particularly if they have competitors who are trying to get these at bargain sales. That's a very real risk. And the other feature that kind of jumps out is being against the conventional wisdom is the provisions about essential facilities. The essential facility doctrine is something that is used very, very rarely. And to be sure, there are sectors that you probably do need to regulate. So telecom jumps out as a sector where if you're going to have competing companies, they have to interconnect. You have to have rules for interconnection. There are different elements of the network that are naturally more concentrated than others. You might want to regulate the prices of those. And so if you have to regulate, you have to regulate, and that's not, and you're admitting defeat in a sense on solving the problem with competition policy. But in those sectors where you have to do that, you should make the decision that, okay, we're going to regulate that sector, right? And we're going to do it in telecom, and we're going to regulate the transmission of electricity and the distribution of electricity in a way that we can still have competition in the generation of electricity, right? But it's a small number of examples where you should make the decision explicitly, I would think. Or are you doing this because because you think the conditions in Mexico really are sufficiently different from the rest of the world that you need that you need these different provisions. And if the answer to that is you think that the legacy of state-owned and state-sanctioned monopolies is worse here than it is in the rest of the world, and I would observe that you're not unique in the world in having this problem. But if that's a problem, you're addressing, I would craft this law in such a way that these special provisions are used to address specifically those sectors. And I think it's important that you craft the law in a way that these very successful companies that are developing these new technologies and these new products, if you think they're not concerned that they might be, some aspect of their service might be deemed essential, and that that's going to make Mexico a less desirable place for them to do business, and that as a consequence, Mexican consumers are going to be denied the full benefits of these products that are being made available throughout the world, I think you're missing an essential piece.